So, this is a story of Finart and Doula. And Finart and Doula had grown up together. They were friends. They were from different families, and they were close in age, and they had similar temperaments, and they were a good fit, shall we say. They were, so everybody was imagining that they would, of course, end up together, because in small communities there's not a lot to choose from. And if the situation arises that people are so aligned with each other from such a young age, there is a natural inclination that they will end up together. And they grew up, and they were not, beautiful in the sense where they were physically attractive. They were just very ordinary, but they were so happy and bouncy and ready for life together, that they had also fallen into this rhythm that they would end up together, and they would produce children, and they would live long lives and be extremely happy, and so on. Finart's father was a carpenter, so he had learned that trade from him, and was working with the father as an apprentice, and was expected, of course, to take over this business as his father got old or passed on. So there was a definite solidity and what is the word? Story that this was going to be real, and it was going to become. Their life was planned out, and they were happy about this, and they could see the trajectory. One day they went to, there was often in traveling fairs and things like that, and one came to the place that Finart and Doula lived, and they went to the fortune teller. And the fortune teller, they went to find out, even though they knew the answer, would they be happy for the rest of their lives, and so on. How many children would we have, and this type of question. They went to ask these questions of the fortune teller. And it's important that you hear, even though they knew the answer, they still went to the fortune teller. So for them it was somewhat of a game. It was not considered, they were doing it for fun. They didn't really believe so much in that, and they had not been brought up in that environment of the fortune teller. So they went along to the fortune teller, and they bounced in and sat down and asked their question, will we have a long, happy life together? And the fortune teller looked at Doula, and looked at Finart, and just looked at them for a very long time. And they became quite nervous. And the fortune teller said to Finart, you will not live as long as your wife. Now, to say that to a young, impressionable, innocent individual who had no thoughts of mortality, no thoughts that anything could be wrong in the world, had an incredibly devastating effect. He was taken aback, became quite angry, dragged Doula from the place and didn't leave any money, and spent the rest of the day quite morose and sulking, and he was not himself. And he went, the fair left, and they continued on with their life, but something had changed in Finart. He became quite withdrawn. He found it difficult to do his work. He didn't want to be around Doula. He didn't want to be socializing or communicating with people. He started to drink. Doula didn't know what to do because everything in her whole life had been about being with Finart and spending their lives together. But Doula was, as we said, not attractive, but she was not unattractive. She was appealing. And as Finart pushed and pushed and pushed Doula away, some of the other young men started to swoop in on that territory. Finart became quite depressed, angry, drank a lot, was abusive to his father, was not able to work, and Doula waited for them what seemed like an eternity, and but he couldn't even look at her, he couldn't be with her, he couldn't have anything to do with her. So it was customary for girls to marry, so in many ways she had no option but to marry, which she did. She married one of the other boys in the village, and they went on to have many children, and they were quite successful in their way. He was the smith's son, so he was apprenticed as the smith, and he took over that when his father was too old, and they had several fine sons and some daughters, and were very successful and very happy. Of course, Doula always had a sadness in her heart about Finart. Finart, interestingly, lived to a ripe old age, but was, for that time, but was never himself again. The Finart that everybody knew, the carpentry, his father's carpentry business folded because Finart was the only boy, and he became like a lost person who lived between the house and the inn where he drank. He ate hardly anything, he just drank. And so this story has many points to it. The first point is that as a shaman, or in this case a fortune teller, but we're going to use the word shaman, it's incredibly important to not predict. Because prediction often fills people with a reality that is actual. So they realize that reality. So for Finart to find out that he would not live as long as his wife, for him meant that he was going to die young and that it was Doula's fault. So he was not with Doula, then he could live a long life, which is what happened. However, being with Doula meant that he was happy and meant that he could thrive. But because he also held this resentment against Doula now, he was unable to grasp any kind of life for himself. That life that he could have had, that was his to have, he thrust aside in anger and resentment and blamed it for his inability to live a long life, when in fact he was creating the environment for himself not to live a long life. It also limits people's, prediction also limits people's ability to think for themselves and to create. So as a shaman, you never predict. You give options, you suggest, you open up the pathways. You don't close the pathways to one very narrow one. you open up many pathways so that they themselves, the people themselves, can come to their creation of themselves. Sometimes the creation of the self entails being with other people or being with another person. This story also looks at that idea that as a human being, to trust what you know is a very difficult thing to do, because we are bound by the view of everybody around us, of what we can see and what we can hear. And if you remember, Finart and Doula went to the fortune teller, and they knew they were going to have a happy life, and they knew they were going to be successful, and they knew they were going to have a lot of children and be a wonderful family. And in a matter of minutes, that was all shattered, because Finart had this impression that they didn't know and that they were wrong. And obviously this person, who is a person of authority and knowledge and knowing, must know more than they do. But it's very often the case that those people don't know more than you do, because they are not living your life. They are not your life. They've never been in your life. And so to rely on those people, or any person, to tell you what is right for you, how to live your life, and what is going to happen if you don't do this, or if you do that, is again a limiting prospect and can be a destroying prospect. So the story of Finart and Doula is really about a knowing of the self and honoring the knowing of the self. And yes, sometimes the knowing of the self, you are going to make mistakes, but it doesn't mean that that knowing was wrong. Perhaps it means that you had to learn something to take you in another direction, or you had to learn something to give you support and strength to go on a different kind of journey. But the knowing, that internal knowing, should never really be pushed aside as wrong. Yes, it's important to listen to people around you, to find other points of view, but not necessarily about you as an individual, as a person, but about situations, about the environment that you're living in. And then you can develop your own idea, your own knowing. But the internal knowing is something that is your eternal knowing. So if you imagine that you have this idea of reincarnation, or that you come back, you have past lives, and people wonder, why don't I remember? Why don't I have that knowledge with me now? Where does it go to? Why does it disappear? That inner knowing has to come from somewhere. It has to come from some knowledge. It has to come from some insights. So whilst it's not always going to be perfect, it is always worth listening to.